Good morning, third year. Hope you're all doing okay and your week's going well. So, last time we were thinking about the type of ideology that was to do with capitalism. Today we're going to think about what you could describe as maybe the opposite of capitalism, which is communism. Just before we get started on communism, here's a quick reminder of what we've learned about capitalism. Okay, so remember the key thing with capitalism is private ownership of companies. Okay, so the government doesn't own the company, individuals do. You could go out and buy a share in Microsoft or buy a share in Coca-Cola. You would own part of that company. Okay. The second is, remember, it's all about making money. So for the same people who own the company, their aim is to try and make as much money as they possibly can. So that's one of the key principles of capitalism. For the consumer, for you and I going out to buy products, there should be choice. So you should be able to buy different types of mobile phones, not just one mobile phone, or different types of bread, or whatever. It doesn't matter what the item is, there should be choice. And because there's choice, there's also then competition. Okay? If you're buying a mobile phone, there's competition between Apple and Samsung and Sony and Nokia and whoever else makes mobile phones. And that means that there's a encouragement for companies to make better phones, to make cheaper phones, to try and get people to buy them. And the final thing is that the government doesn't get too involved in what goes on with business. So in Britain, for example, the government does get involved in things like making sure that workers are paid a minimum wage, or making sure that factories are safe. But beyond that, they try to stay out of the way of business. They don't get too involved. So try and remember those four features of capitalism when we talk about communism, and then you can contrast the two. So what we're going to think about today is, well, what is communism, first of all? And mainly we're going to think about some of the differences between communism and capitalism. And a bit like we did last week, I'm going to set you a task, but then also I'm going to set some discussion questions. We had a really, really good discussion last week. So I'd like to keep that going this week with your opinions on communism. So we'll do that after I've gone through this presentation. So the political spectrum is an important thing to try and understand in terms of politics tends to not just be about extremes. Okay, you tend to have lots of stuff in the middle. So you'll hear these phrases used quite a lot, and we'll go into this in more detail later. Left wing and right wing. Okay, so left wing governments tend to, the extreme left wing would be a communist government. Moving towards the middle, you get a sort of socialist government, and then moving towards the right, you get into capitalism. You could argue that Britain is in that centre ground. Okay, so we have things like a free national health service. We pay taxes so that you get public services like free education. Those things are quite socialist, quite centre ground, but also we're quite capitalist. So our economic system is certainly not communist, it's capitalist. So we're kind of in that centre ground in the UK. If you go to the extreme right, you get to fascists, and probably some of the fascists that you'll have heard of in history, Adolf Hitler being Hitler and the Nazis being probably the most famous of the fascists in the last century. So have a think about these terms. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail now because it will get us a bit bogged down in thinking about the spectrum. But the important thing is to try and remember that politics doesn't happen on just you're a communist or you're a capitalist. There's a spectrum. Okay, there's a bit in the middle where people can have bits of both. Okay. So here are some of the key features of communism. The pictures in the background are all quite old because in reality, communism nowadays doesn't really exist in the same way as it was idealistically supposed to exist in the 20th century and before. So I'll show you some of the countries that still have communism today, but there's really no truly communist country anywhere in the world anymore. So the pictures are quite old because we don't have really recent examples. One of the key principles of communism, and you should be starting to think of differences here with capitalism, is that all property in business is owned by the government collectively. Now, communism is all about the people owning all of the business and property in the country. In reality, it's owned by the government, but the idea is that individuals don't own anything, particularly not business. Okay? Second principle is, off the back of that, because you don't own anything, then one of the principles of communism is that the people, the workers, get whatever they need and they contribute whatever they can. So in other words, if you need a house, if you need healthcare, if you need education, then that will be provided for you for free. Okay? And in return, you work to pay into the common good. You work to pay into the system. So we have a bit of that in this country, where you work hard, you pay taxes, and the taxes pay for the National Health Service, and you get free healthcare. But we don't have it completely. You don't get a free house, for example, and we still have to pay for a lot of other things. And we also get to keep some of that money. We don't pay everything in tax. So, third principle. So, the main aim of communism really was to try and get rid of this class system. The class system is this idea that there are working people who go out and do all the work to create the wealth, and there are rich people, the upper classes, who benefit from all of that wealth but don't actually do the work. So if you took a factory, for example, you could have people who work really, really hard in the factory on the machine lines all day long, producing whatever it is they're producing, maybe in quite dangerous circumstances, and all the money that they generate from what they've been making goes to the people who own the factory, goes to the upper classes. Okay? So the idea of communism was to get rid of that. We won't have factory owners because everyone will own the factory. So you no longer have the poor doing the work and the rich making all the money. That was one of the principles of capitalism. And the final one is, because of all of these things, communism needs a very, very strong government, because someone has to make all the decisions about services, about wages, and because everyone collectively pays into this pot and everyone collectively gets these services, there's not really that much room for disagreement. So democracy doesn't really work that well with communism, because what you might end up with in a democratic system is people maybe disagreeing with some of these decisions. Well, you can't have that, because it's the collective that's making a decision, all the people together. So what that means is, in some of the most famous communist states in history, if we think of the Soviet Union, which is now Russia, very, very strong dictatorial government to try and enforce this. And some of the other countries I'll show you in a second, very strong dictatorial government as well. No democracy in a communist state. Okay? Now, there are only 5 countries left in the world that identify as being communist. Cuba and North Korea, you're actually going to look at in more detail with Mr. Gifford as 2 case studies of communism, and 2 quite different case studies of communism as well. Vietnam, China, and Laos are also communist countries. You see, apart from Cuba, which is in the Americas, all of the countries are in Southeast Asia. Now, even these countries aren't purely communist. There's some debate about whether they are in fact really communist countries or not. China, for example, is one of the biggest producer of products on the world marketplace. You think of your iPhone, you think of a lot of your clothes, you think of a lot of electronic products that we use here. They're mostly produced in China, and there are extremely wealthy Chinese billionaires. So there's a lot of debate about whether these countries really are communist or not, but they identify as being communist. So those are the 5 countries left in the world. So some potential problems with communism. First of all, because the government runs all of the industries, there's no competition. Okay, so in a communist system, everybody produces the goods for the collective good of the country. There's no factory that produces a different version of a product to a different version of a product and makes it better or cheaper or anything like that. So what that means is, well, if your product's going to sell anyway, then there's not that much point in making it better, right? Why bother making a car faster if people are going to buy the one that was cheaper to make anyway. So what tended to happen was these communist countries got a bit stuck historically. They didn't make the advances that a lot of capitalist countries made. And you'll learn quite a bit about that when you look at Cuba, although there's a few other aspects that are involved in that as well. As I mentioned before, one of the potential problems is that the government has to have a lot of control in a communist country. So the people end up with fewer rights, very, very difficult to disagree with the government. Okay, and if we look at the Soviet Union's history, really at any communist country's history, quite brutal treatment of people who tried to criticize the government. Okay. The third one is an interesting one, which is a bit of a debate. I'm not going to tell you that this is a fact or not, but people argue that unless you have an incentive, you might not work so hard. Remember, we had this debate last week to do with capitalism, sorry. That one of the main arguments was if there's the potential you might become rich, then there's more encouragement for you to go out and work hard. And there was a bit of disagreement on that, although most of you, I think, agreed with that principle. So if under this system, no matter how hard you work, you'll always earn the same wage as everybody else. And it doesn't matter what your job is, you'll earn the same wage, you'll live in the same housing, you'll have the same everything else. Then is there much encouragement to go out and work harder? I think there's a bit of a debate about that, but that is definitely an argument that people make about communism. So, the task I want you to work on today, so we're going to do two things today. I'm going to set you some questions to think about, and then we'll have a wee bit of a debate later on, maybe about 12 o'clock. We'll have a bit of a debate on the Microsoft team. But the main task I want you to work on just now is to create an infographic about capitalism and communism. Okay, so next week with Mr. Gifford, you're going to go on to look at some case studies. So I really want you to understand these two types of economic ideology just now before you move on to the case studies. An infographic, I'll show you some examples in a moment, but basically it's like a poster, but it's a way of trying to put complicated information into really, really simple form so that you can understand it really clearly. And hopefully there may be someone in your house at home who doesn't know what capitalism and communism is either. And the idea is that your infographic should be simple enough that someone who's never heard of those two things before should be able to understand it. And it's a useful revision tool for you as well. If you Google infographic and go to Google Images, you'll see hundreds of these. They're really, really popular. Okay, so I want you to include what actually is capitalism and communism, and then the positives and negatives of both of them. And remember, there are lots of positives and negatives of capitalism, and there are lots of positives and negatives of communism, right? And then maybe at the bottom you could put your own opinion as well, but try and make it balanced so that we've got positives and negatives, because one isn't necessarily better than the other. Put as much detail as you can into this, because this will be a really, really good revision for you. So here are examples of infographics that have nothing to do with capitalism and communism, but just to show you what they might kind of look like. So you can see they've usually got little pictures and then information coming out from them. If you want to do this in the computer, there's quite a lot of free apps on the computer that you can use to get information about this. Okay, any questions about this? As usual, post a reply on the team and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Otherwise, have a really, really good day, and I hope the rest of your week and your weekend goes well, and I'll speak to you again sometime soon. Okay, cheers, bye.